Okay, so welcome to today's video in which we are going to be looking at the scene of Fezziwig's ball. So as usual, I'm just going to read through this extract from this part of the text, and as usual the timings for the analysis will be just below this video, so if you don't need to listen to this part of the text read aloud, just jump forwards to the bit that's relevant for you. Okay, let's start. Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here too it was Christmas time again, but it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it?" said Scrooge. "Was I apprenticed here?" They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer! Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson." You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. "Hilly-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick! Cheer up, Ebenezer!" Clear away! There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who was suspected of not having board enough from his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door but one, who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping, old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again as soon as they got there, all top couples at last and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" and the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter specially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest, upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he were a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if they had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, let me tell higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place, Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from them, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon its head burnt very clear. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. The spirit signed to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, said, "Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that," said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and speaking unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. "It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Well, something, I think," the ghost insisted. "No," said Scrooge, "no. I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. Okay, so as you can see, I've highlighted lots and lots of quotations from this extract. I'm going to whiz through these as quickly as I can because there's a kind of key idea that you would need to take from this scene, but in terms of quotations, this is more about just helping your overall understanding. So let's start with our analysis. First of all, look at how familiar Scrooge is with this place. He says, "Know it, was I apprenticed here." So again, Dickens shows us that Scrooge is excited to revisit this part of his past. Look at the use of the exclamation marks there, indicating that Scrooge is speaking with some passion or excitement. So he's pleased to go back to this part of his past when he was learning his trade as an apprentice. When he sees his old boss, he cries out, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again." So this is Scrooge's old employer, and again Dickens illustrates Scrooge's happiness and excitement to see him through the use of that verb cried, just in the line above, and he emphasises this enthusiasm as Scrooge is emotionally moved enough to say, "Bless his heart." And this is a phrase that has religious connotations, and it also suggests a warmth and a positivity that we haven't yet seen from Scrooge. Think about the way that he spoke to Fred in Stave 1, someone that he's related to, and now listen to the way that he speaks with such warmth and enthusiasm, even using religious language positively to talk about his respect for his boss, his former employer. Just a small contextual detail here. You might have thought that it was strange that they're not finishing work until 7 in the evening. So during the period that Dickens was writing, it was common to work for 10 or 12-hour days. This is during the period of the Industrial Revolution. So finishing work at 7 p.m. actually suggests that Fezziwig is generously allowing an early end to the working day because they are having this celebration and because it is Christmas time. So far from suggesting that Fezziwig is a cruel employer, this actually, when you take into consideration the context in which Dickens was writing, suggests that he is showing generosity. So it's important that we consider the time and the place in which Dickens was writing. It's very different from ours now. The way that Fezziwig laughs suggests immediately this joyful, happy character. He's portrayed as joyful and light-hearted. In this phrase, laughed all over himself, which metaphorically suggests that this joy pervades, it fills his whole body. He doesn't just laugh with his face with his voice, it sort of takes over every part of him. So just like Scrooge's coldness fills his whole body and it seems to almost possess him, this joy is what fills Fezziwig. Furthermore, Dickens uses this phrase, organ of benevolence, and this is an obscure and quite strange phrase. There are deeper connotations and meanings to this that you might want to explore. If you search up this phrase, you'll find a little more detail, but essentially it is referring to Fezziwig's head, and benevolence means kindness, so it's referring to this aspect of Fezziwig's head as his organ of benevolence, suggesting his kind and generous personality. Furthermore, Dickens uses a series of sensory adjectives to describe Fezziwig's voice. It's oily and rich and fat, and none of those words really match up with our impression of what a voice sounds like, but they give us this idea of abundance, almost a sense of plenty. This isn't a meagre, thin little voice. It's an oily and rich and fat and jovial one. Jovial meaning, again, joyful and happy. So immediately, from Scrooge's reaction to seeing Fezziwig and from Dickens's choices of language in terms of how Fezziwig's his body and his laugh, his voice are portrayed, this creates a sense of welcome and generosity. Now, Fezziwig is used by Dickens specifically to contrast Scrooge's appearance as an employer in Stave 1. Think about, as you read this extract again as we go through the analysis, think about how Dickens presented Scrooge as Bob Cratchit's employer in Stave 1, and just think about the ways in which Fezziwig is very, very different as a boss, as an employer, from Scrooge in that first stave. We also see here that Scrooge had a friend, his fellow apprentice, Dick Wilkins, and he seems to speak of him very fondly as well. So he continues to seem pleased at the reappearances of former friends and acquaintances. He's pleased to see Dick Wilkins, he's pleased to see Mr. Fezziwig. In the previous extract that we looked at, he was delighted to see little Fan, his younger sister, and again before that, even as he was reflecting on his lonely childhood, he was happy to see all of the local people who lived in his town near his school. So we see that he wasn't always the isolated, lonely character that he is in his present-day life as portrayed in Stave 1. We start to wonder what changed. Fezziwig tells the boys that they are closing up for work for that evening. Fezziwig speaks in this very stylised, quite eccentric, quite strange way, yo-ho my boys, creating again that impression of cheerfulness and exuberance. Fezziwig is clearly excited by the prospect of Christmas, again unlike Scrooge, so again Dickens is presenting us with a contrast. While Scrooge was cross with Bob Cratchit for not working on Christmas Day, Fezziwig happily anticipates the holiday celebrations and shuts up his business promptly. So he's quite delighted at the idea of finishing work and celebrating the Christmas period. Okay, looking down at the way in which the warehouse is prepared for this Christmas party, I just want to draw your attention to this little section of the description here, particularly this line that fuel was heaped upon the fire. And again, this is being used specifically to cause us to reflect on Scrooge's own miserable, freezing cold office and poor Bob Cratchit's fire, which seems to be just one coal. So unlike that miserable atmosphere depicted early on in the novel, when we see how Fezziwig prepares for his party, he's generously warming the warehouse in preparation for his guests. That word heaped again suggests that there's no scrimping or saving. He's not watching every little coal. His only thought is for the comfort of his guests, so they heap the fuel upon the fire, making the warehouse as snug and warm and dry and bright as you would desire to see on a winter's night, so it becomes a ballroom. So the idea of that warmth, that physical comfort, is again being associated with kindness and generosity and the spirit of Christmas, and you'll see that idea repeated again as we read further into this novel. Okay, then we meet Mr. Fezziwig's family. So we meet Mrs. Fezziwig, or we at least have a description of her, and the three Miss Fezziwigs, and they are all described as these equally joyful individuals. So Dickens uses a metaphor here, comparing Mrs. Fezziwig to one vast substantial smile, suggesting almost that she is the embodiment of happiness itself. If happiness took a physical form, if it had a body, she would be it. She is the physical representation of happiness because she is simply one vast substantial smile. So again, suggesting warmth and kindness and happiness and friendliness and all of those things that Scrooge, at least in his present day version of his character, is not. Furthermore, Fezziwig has children, 3 daughters, each of whom are beaming and lovable. So Dickens here uses the Fezziwigs, the Fezziwig family, to represent this idealised Victorian family. They are the perfect family unit, full of joy, kindness, generosity, affection. And you can see just from the use of the words smile and beaming, all of them are portrayed as friendly and open to those around them. Again, unlike Scrooge. So Dickens is tuning us in here to the importance of family within the novel and suggesting perhaps as well that family and family love are what bring joy and happiness, not, as Scrooge so misguidedly assumes, that is caused by money. Okay, so continuing, we have this long list of characters. In came the 6 young followers, in came all the young men, in came this person, in came that person, and the use of that repetition, in came, is used to create the sense of this enormous gathering, used to emphasise how many people are welcome at this party. And again, we're starting to think perhaps of the cost and the generosity that this displays in Fezziwig. In they all came anyhow. So Dickens uses a long list of characters of different statuses, and this indicates that everyone is welcome at this gathering. This isn't a sort of exclusive event. This is a happy, warm, open evening where many people are welcome to come and celebrate the Christmas period together. Dickens then gives us quite a long description of some dancing, and he focuses on what a wonderful dancer old Fezziwig is. Despite his age, he seems to be a sprightly fellow. And then we get this greater description of everything else that is present there. There are dances and forfeits, and then a long description of all of the food that there is, and mince pies and beer. So this scene is being used to illustrate the Fezziwigs' generosity of spirit. As a family, they're synonymous with, they are interchangeable with music and colour and kindness. They represent the idealised Victorian family, and they represent the spirit of Christmas. Here we see the feast that they have prepared for their guests. So again, there's no penny pinching here, there's no miserly behaviour like that we see from Scrooge in Stave 1. Everything is about making sure their guests are comfortable and happy. Continuing on, more descriptions of Fezziwig and his dancing and his glowing calves, suggesting that everyone is watching his fancy footwork. But at the end of the evening, really significantly, Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stand either side of the door and they shake hands with everyone as they leave, wishing them a Merry Christmas. So again, this is used specifically to illustrate the stark contrast between the Fezziwigs and Scrooge. As employer, Fezziwig is warm and he wishes his friends well. Scrooge in Stave 1 treats Fred's Christmas greetings with contempt, so he's almost disgusted by Fred's Christmas spirit and his happiness. So here we see the difference. The Fezziwigs are full of the Christmas spirit and they share that with everyone that they know. Now we might expect that Scrooge would feel grumpy, that he would be sort of cantankerous and insulting all of this dancing and all of this celebration, because from what we know of Scrooge so far, he really does seem quite starkly opposed to Christmas and certainly to any unnecessary expenditure, any unnecessary spending of money. But far from it. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene and with his former self. So out of his wits, suggesting he seems insane as he's watching this. He doesn't seem like himself at all. His heart and his soul were in the scene. So this affects him emotionally, but potentially in that word soul, it also has a spiritual impact on him. But most significantly, he is with his former self. He's been taken back to this time and he now remembers how it felt to be involved in such celebrations. So this memory transports Scrooge, reminding him of how he used to be, reminding him of what his former self was like. and it is his former self, not his self entirely, because he's changed so much. So we start to question as readers how this change has come about. Why is Scrooge so miserable in his in his old age? We wonder as well how he could have failed to remember what the Fezziwig's example taught him. So having had such a kind employer, having had people around him as a young man who so joyfully celebrated the Christmas period, why is he so filled with hatred and frustration and anger now? However, this does also suggest to us that he has the capacity to change, he has the potential to develop as a character, because this scene doesn't make him frustrated, this scene doesn't make him angry, this scene brings him joy, and that suggests that he doesn't truly hate Christmas and he doesn't truly hate his fellow man. Somewhere buried deep within him is this man who once enjoyed such Christmas celebrations. The ghost slightly tries to draw some of these feelings out of Scrooge. The ghost suggests that it's a small matter, an easy thing to make these people so full of gratitude, to make your guests so happy. So the ghost suggests that it's a small thing to make people happy and grateful, but Scrooge reacts with surprise. He echoes the word small, suggesting he thinks it's not a small matter at all, but something more significant. The spirit gestures to him to listen to how he and his fellow apprentice Dick talk about Fezziwig and what a good employer he is and what he's done, his generosity, and suggests that surely it's an easy thing to just spend a little bit of money. How can that be so worthy of praise? But Scrooge is heated by the remark. That phrase from the ghost annoys him, it irritates him, that this suggestion that Fezziwig has done something minor and unimportant. And Scrooge says, the happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. So Dickens again is hinting at the beginning of Scrooge's transformation of character. He realises that the happiness Fezziwig creates through his kindness and generosity is as great as if it cost a fortune. He realises that the worth of happiness is greater than that of money. So it's more important to be happy than to be wealthy. He says this happiness is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. So even though it may have only cost him a few pounds to throw this celebration, the effect that it has, the happiness that he creates, is worth so much more. So this contrasts again with how he spoke to Fred in Stave 1, when he says, "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." There, he associates happiness with having a lot of money, and he associates poverty with misery. But here he's suggesting that actually it doesn't take a huge amount of money to create an enormous impact on those around you. Furthermore, we see that it has started to cause him to reflect upon his own behaviours. We see that this is triggering his conscience a little bit, because at the end he says, "I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now." So this indicates that Scrooge is beginning to feel guilty about his treatment of Bob Cratchit. So this scene leaves us with this one question: how has Scrooge changed so much and why? And in the next extract that we look at, in which we encounter Scrooge's former fiancée, Belle, we will understand some of the reasons for Scrooge's change of heart. Okay, I hope that that's been useful. Good luck with your revision, good luck with your studies, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.